Now, we need to move on to one of the what's going to be one of the bigger political rows of the day, and I suspect it's already bubbling along quite nicely. So Keir Starmer said yesterday that under Labour, they would keep the 2-child cap on child benefit, something that was introduced by the Tories to save money and which Labour has argued ever since is cruel, that it puts children into poverty, it disproportionately affects single parents, puts the abortion rate up, all sorts of things. And Labour has said for all those years, Lizzie, that they would reverse that cap, that they would take it away. So what on earth is going on?
Yeah, so for a long time, a lot of Labour MPs, including Keir Starmer, have said that they'd get rid of the cap. It's one of the kind of austerity era policies that's considered even by some Conservative MPs to be cruel and, divisive. I mean, there's a huge study out today that says the 2-child benefit limit and the benefit cap have both failed entirely in their aims and need to be scrapped immediately because they're not only pushing families into poverty, but they also aren't achieving their original aims, which was the point of the child benefit cap, the 2-child benefit limit back when it was designed, was supposedly to get parents back into work, get parents working more hours, basically by taking away their money so they have to work. But all it's done, that hasn't worked, according to a 3-year study by the University of Work.
Anyone who's got
cruel and mad,
If you've got to go back to work, you have to pay for childcare, which is more than 13 quid a week, which is how much you get for a second child. So, I mean...
Yeah. So all this is done...
Tories have never had... They've never had to do any of these sums, have they?
No.
They've never had to live with this.
And all this has done is basically created a situation where around parents lose out on around £3,000 a year per child under these rules if they've got more than 2 kids. So, £3,000 on your third and another £3,000 on your fourth. So it also disproportionately impacts, renters, like larger families, often people from ethnic minority backgrounds who might have larger families, that sort of thing. It's just a mess. And Labour have got themselves into a bit of a mess with it as well, where, for a long time they said they were going to get rid of it. And then when Keir Starmer became leader, he eventually said that he was going to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn's 2019 manifesto completely. He was junking it. They're going to start again. And people have been trying to pin them down on it for a long time. And then Jonathan Ashworth, Labour's Shadow Work and Pension Secretary, told the Mirror a month ago that he thought the policy was heinous and was absolutely pushing kids into poverty. And that was interpreted as a sign that Labour were going to scrap it. They were going to get rid of it. And then yesterday, Keir Starmer said, no, we're not changing the policy. And everybody was a bit like, how can you keep something that your welfare spokesman says is heinous and is making children poor?
Just had a report out, today going, doesn't work. Terrible idea. And this is going to cause a massive stink. Now, tell us what you think, everybody. Have you got more than one child? Did the £13 a week make the tiniest amount of difference to your ability to afford to look after that child? It does sometimes, but most people it really doesn't, because it's just not enough, especially in the current climate. Do you think that cap should be lifted? Do you think it's cruel? Do you think it's absolutely fine? Do you think somehow it acts as birth control? Do let us know, get into the comments. But this is going to cause a stink because the Labour Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, as you've said, has called it heinous. We've got Deputy Leader Angela Rayner called it obscene and inhumane. The Pensions Shadow Pension Secretary, Jonathan Ashworth, said it's pushing children and families into poverty and is one of the most heinous elements of the Tory welfare system. And some anonymous Labour MPs are briefing out today that they weren't consulted about this policy switch, and I suspect they weren't consulted because they wouldn't agree with it. Lizzie,
they wouldn't. Yeah.
No, exactly. Sorry. Do you think, is this a sign that Keir is kind of riding roughshod over his own party and its values? He's being too tough, or that he's doing the other thing he's always criticised for, which is flip-flopping and being too weak? Which is it?
I don't think it's flip-flopping. I think this is part of the same picture as free school meals. It's about money. It's about the fact that, I don't know exactly what the cost would be per year for getting rid of that policy, but I suspect it would be, in the billions. And it's about money. It's about the fact that they don't know. Labour, as we were saying before, have created this system where they've said, okay, we're going to recruit more teachers, but we're going to pay for that by scrapping the non-dom tax status, or we're going to, you know, they've come up with these sort of slightly like these ideas of raising money to pay for their policies without raising taxes and without cutting public spending. And there aren't that many things that they can do that with. So there aren't that many policies that they can announce. And I think this is expensive. They're not sure how they pay for it, so they can't say that they can. So I think that's part of it. But I also do think there is a part of it as well that is, you know, some of the people in Keir's office that I've spoken to in recent months to sort of say, you know, that they're trying very hard to kind of to make sure they're not held back by any kind of old myths about Labour. So, you know, they are not worried about talking about Brexit. They're talking about immigration, you know, that sort of thing, issues that have been traditionally quite difficult for Labour. And I think welfare is kind of part of this. You know, I think they're saying we're going to be tough on welfare because that's something that the Conservatives will maybe attack them on, of saying, you know, oh, you're going to splash loads of money on this and that. So I do think that's part of the picture, but it's not all. And you know, I don't know exactly why they've decided that this is a line that they don't want to cross, but I suspect there'll be a lot of pressure on them to change their minds.
Exactly. You've got to, in order to sort of stake your party unity on something, if this is the one, then I mean, you know, it's a bit like the boats issue. You're just going to look cruel if you try and stick to it in some ways. And it is very important to huge numbers of people. And what are they? You know, that Angela Rayner said a few years ago that this cap had to go. Now, she wasn't available for comment last night when journalists were ringing around trying to say, what do you think about this, Angela? Trying to get her reaction. But she's addressing the Parliamentary Labour Party tonight. They're going to be asking her. Other Labour frontbenchers are doing the interviews today. There is obviously going to be a split about this. And does Labour have the luxury, I suppose, of having a split, of the leader kind of promoting a split? Because he could have just not said it. He could have said, we don't know yet. He could have fluffed it away. He didn't have to do this. Do they have the luxury of doing that when they're not even in power yet?
Well, it's interesting because that you say that, like, Keir did quite a long interview on BBC's Laura Kuenssberg, Sunday with Laura Kuenssberg yesterday, in which he didn't answer almost any questions. You know, he kept being asked about public services, about public sector pay, public spending, all of this, and he didn't give a clear answer on anything. But when he was asked about the 2-child benefit cap, he just said, no, we're not changing that policy. He was absolutely clear, and that was it. And I wish he'd been pressed a bit more on that. But obviously that's, you know, they have a lot of ground to cover in those interviews. But he obviously decided that was something he wanted to say. So maybe this is a battle he wants to have. But I think you're right that I'm not sure they do have the luxury to be having these sorts of arguments in public. Like, you know, the Labour leadership might say, you know, it's good, like Labour's a broad church, it's important for us to have conversations about how we work these things out. And they can't control everybody, but ultimately divided parties don't win elections, is the old saying. And so, you know, Labour needs to have a clear offer that they're standing on, that the public understand and that the MPs believe in. And I think we're not there yet, because the public, you know, a lot of these arguments are happening because there is a bit of a vacuum in terms of what, no one really knows what Labour's policies are.
Do you think then, from what you've just said, I mean, we've got the Conservatives who've been disunited since 2016 and before, let's face it. And when you've got that to go up against, you really need to appear united. But maybe it's kind of, there's a bigger political game here, and Keir wants to look tough with his own party, that would win him some votes, because that's one of the things he's always, you know, Labour was accused of being weak internally. And secondly, that if he just sort of manages to stamp his authority and go, no way, we're going to save money, that in itself is a wider message that would appeal to the electorate in time for a general election next year. And that perhaps the strategists have decided that is a fight to go and have, because you will end up looking better than Rishi Sunak, who's just screwing people over. You're saying, look, we're not going to make anything any worse. But we can't make it better yet. We're going to wait until the economy is growing before we do make it better. We are going to do those things. We have those aspirations. But right now, we're going to be careful. I mean, that's despite the disunity that produces, is that an overall bigger win, do you think?
It could be. And also it's worth thinking as well that, all parties have fights, and the Tories have been fighting like rats in a sack for years. It's not unusual for this to happen. And it is a sign in a way of, like different views, people feeling emboldened to have those. And that's how policy gets made. But I do think that these arguments are going to keep happening if there is this kind of vacuum. And obviously, it is quite a long way out from an election still. And Keir has set out his 5 missions, which some people said were a little bit vague. I thought that a couple of them, particularly the last one, the opportunities one about education, gave me a bit more of a sense of what I thought he was trying to do. But, I think if the Labour leadership aren't prepared to sort of say what they stand for, people will start trying to find ways in and saying, okay, you should stand for this.
Yes, and then you end up meaning everything to everybody, and then that's all very well. It's a good way to get elected, maybe, but then when you do get elected, you end up disappointing everybody because you can't do all those things that they kind of have imagined you should do. And what do you think, everybody? Where are you on the child benefit cap? Do you think that Labour is being careful and saving its money? Do you think Keir is being sort of quite a good strategist and provoking a row that makes him look tough on the finances? Or is this just really poor party management? David says, I think we have to be responsible. There are guidelines that have to be adhered to. We can't just keep having children we can't afford and expect taxpayers to fork out the money. Well, do you know what, David? Boris Johnson can't afford all his children. And he's qualifying for the child benefit as well, or as various women are. And he's obviously right, he's starting to earn a bit more money now, isn't he, Lizzie? And he's getting a lot on speeches and stuff, but he's spending on cheese. So, if there are irresponsible people in the world, and they're not always the poorest ones, shall we say. Now, this Thursday, and this is perhaps why it's all going to matter or not matter, we've got 3 by-elections in Tory seats. There may be a 4th in the mix if Nadine Dorries ever gets round to her resigning with immediate effect, which happened months ago and apparently isn't happening now. But the BBC are reporting this morning that the Tories are briefing. They're going to lose all 3 of them, and lose them horribly is the word that Chris Mason used on Radio 4 this morning, which was worth staying up late at night to watch the results if it's going to be horrible. Lizzie, does it matter what Labour says? What they are or they aren't doing? All they really need to do is gain power, is just to be a safer pair of hands than any of this lot, which is, you could ask the cat and there'd be a better option. If they're going to lose that badly, I mean, Keir Starmer could, spend the next year in the Wetherspoons drinking Cobra, and is still going to get elected, isn't he?
I don't think that's true. I think that, polls, if we've learned anything from the last few years, is that things can happen that you don't expect. And, a year is a long time. And I think this election, the general election, is Labour's to lose. Absolutely. The conditions are, very fortuitous for them in terms of where we are. 13 years of Tory government, everything doesn't work. Like political chaos, all of that, the public fed up. This is a situation where Labour could really do well. But the problem is there will be people who will always vote Conservative. There will be people who are on the fence but aren't really sure about Labour, and Keir will have to persuade them. And then there are going to be people who might not bother because they're disenchanted with politics, all of that. And the end result is, even if Labour continue to poll well and do well in the election, if they can't get a proper majority, they're going to have to form some sort of minority government, which involves a series of really difficult choices. You either have to make a pact with the SNP to prop you up, the price of which would be a second independence referendum, or you make a pact with the Lib Dems, which is politically toxic after the coalition. They don't want to be doing that. Labour really don't want to be making coalitions, and they keep ruling it out in theory, though obviously everything is always on the table. So they do need to win, and they need to win convincingly for this to work. And if they want to be able to actually deliver in government, Boris Johnson won an 80-seat majority, but remember when Theresa May had to rely on the DUP and she couldn't get anything through? If Keir Starmer gets into power and then can't deliver any policies because the Tories just frustrate him at every turn, that is not what they want either. So I do think that Labour do have to win the hearts and, you know, maybe to be a bit, you know, sentimental or whatever about it, but you have to give people hope. You've got to win hearts and minds. It's not enough to not just be the Tories.
They definitely, well, I don't know, it's a start. They definitely have to have a bit of the whole kind of Obama hopey changey stuff going on. Very quickly before we move on to good news, do you think when this National Policy Forum, when they come back with these manifesto pledges and it's all sorted out by October and they're going into the last year before the election with a manifesto that is somehow a bit clearer than what we've had for the last few years, is that going to be vague, wishy-washy, we'd like to do this but we don't have the money, or is it going to be a thumping, we're gonna do that kind of decisive document that we're
coming the National Policy Forum?
Well, when they finally get the manifesto pledges and the policies ironed out this summer, are we going to see the kind of things we can get our teeth into, or is it still going to be a bit vague and wishy-washy?
I think we won't see the really nailed-on stuff until we get the manifesto, and I think they'll hold out. But I do think that whilst I think the National Policy Forum will be a lot of talking, you know, there are a lot of people expressing views. It might give us a way of reading where the kind of conflicts are and what issues are important to trade unions and to voters, to members. But I think Labour conference in the autumn is going to be that's going to be a time when you start to see like what the priorities are, like who gets a speech, what the speeches are about, what Keir decides to speak about in his final leader's speech, you know, all of that. I think there will be some policy there. There'll be ideas. They'll be trying to lean into the next election. So I think there will be lots of vague stuff around, but I think that's when we'll start to get a much clearer idea.
Well, nuclear veterans and free school meals, please, Keir. That's my offer. We will have to see, won't we? Thank you for that, Lizzie. Do let us know your questions, everybody. How do you feel about where Labour are? Do you think they're ready for power? Do you think they're arguing and splitting and dividing? Do you think they're being careful with the money and that's the way to get in? Or do they need to start making some radical offers, some big ticket, go, right, we're going to have a national care service. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. Bosh. Vote for us and you get a better country out of it. Who knows?